Oh, the Galactic Diplomatic Corps thought they were being so clever. They really did. When the Central Accord decided that Ambassador Priyesh Nair needed a personal protection detail, there were 17 perfectly reasonable candidates on the roster. Trained Velhari sentinels with their redundant nervous systems, Kreth security specialists with their armored carapaces, even a Duan crowd control veteran with 4 arms and the temperament of a slow-moving glacier, calm, professional, thoroughly vetted. And then, somewhere between the 3rd budget meeting and the 4th interdepartmental memo, someone in the Office of Personnel Allocation made a clerical decision that would go down in Accord history as either the greatest mistake or the most accidental stroke of genius anyone had ever committed with a data stylus. They assigned him Corporal Dara Okeke, human, female, age 29, species, Homo sapiens, planet of origin, Earth. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Earth, let me paint you a picture. Actually, no, let me just read you the standard Accord species threat assessment, because that document alone should have been enough to make someone in personnel stop, put down their morning beverage, and ask a very serious question. Quote, Homo sapiens are a Class 4 Deathworld species originating from a high-gravity, high-radiation, biologically hostile planet teeming with apex predators, extreme weather events, tectonic instability, and an evolutionary history defined entirely by the principle of survive or be eaten. Recommend extreme caution in conflict scenarios. Do not engage in prolonged physical confrontation. Do not attempt to outpace on foot. Do not, under any circumstances, assume that visible injury has incapacitated the subject. End quote. Someone stamped approved on that assignment and went to lunch. Ambassador Priyesh Nair found out about his new bodyguard, the same way he found out about most things, which was through his aide, a nervous, 7-limbed tesseri named Quilvet, who delivered information the way someone might hand you a lit explosive quickly, from a distance already backing away. Your protection detail has been finalized, Quilvet said, sliding a data chip across the briefing table without making full eye contact. The Accord sends their assurances that she is highly qualified. Priyesh, who had been serving as the Accord's lead negotiator in the Yanari corridor for 11 years and had survived 4 assassination attempts, 2 diplomatic collapses, and 1 truly catastrophic misunderstanding involving a Grethali mating display, looked at the data chip with the quiet suspicion of a man who had learned that assurances were usually the prelude to something extraordinary. He picked it up. He read it. He set it back down. She's human, he said. Yes, Quilvet said. She's from Earth. Yes. A long pause. Priyesh was himself human, born in Kochi, India, and he had grown up surrounded by people who swam in monsoon floods and argued with street dogs and ate food that made other species weep just from the smell. He understood, on a deep and personal level, exactly what a trained human soldier was. Has anyone briefed the rest of the security team? He asked. Quilvet's secondary limbs did a thing that roughly translated to please do not make this my problem. I'll take that as a no, Priyesh said. Corporal Dara Okeke arrived at Docking Bay 14 on the station Varath crossing at 0600 hours, station time, 40 minutes early, in full dress uniform, carrying a pack that weighed approximately what a Velhari adolescent weighed, and looking like she had slept perfectly, and was mildly disappointed that no one had tried to stop her at the checkpoint. She was not tall by human standards. She was not by most species standards visually intimidating. She stood roughly 1.7 meters, with close-cropped hair, brown skin, and the kind of calm, assessing eyes that senior Accord security consultants paid hundreds of thousands of credits to try to teach their recruits, and mostly failed. The station's existing security detail, a 4-being team led by a Velhari named Instructor San, watched her walk across the docking bay and had the collective unspoken reaction of, that is not so bad. Actually, we were worried for nothing. This was, of course, the precise moment Dara noticed that one of the magnetic clamps on Bay 14's secondary cargo arm was fractionally misaligned, calculated in approximately 1.3 seconds that it would shear loose within the next few minutes under current load stress, identified the 3 beings standing directly beneath its fall radius, and crossed 40 meters of docking bay floor in a time frame that caused Instructor San's threat assessment implant to briefly malfunction from sheer confusion. She shoved all 3 of them clear. The clamp came down. It hit the deck where they had been standing with a sound like a small geological event. Everyone stared at her. She looked at the clamp. She looked at them. She said, very calmly, "You should get that fixed," and then picked up her pack and continued walking toward the security briefing room, as if she had simply stepped around a puddle. Instructor San stood in the wreckage of the clamp for a very long moment. Then he opened a private channel to Quilvet and said, very quietly, "I think I understand the threat assessment now." The Yanari corridor negotiations were, to put it diplomatically, a disaster waiting to happen. 3 factions with overlapping territorial claims, centuries of cultural grievance, and a mutual distrust so profound that seating arrangements for the first plenary session had required 6 weeks of pre-negotiation. Ambassador Priyesh had been working this file for 2 years. He knew every player, every pressure point, every moment where the whole thing could tip from tense to catastrophic. What he had not fully accounted for was the effect of Corporal Dara Okeke standing silently beside his chair at every session. The Yanari delegation noticed her first. Their lead negotiator, a lean, sharp-eyed elder named Councillor Brix Vayan, spent the first 40 minutes of the opening session trying to figure out what exactly she was. He had catalogued her species, read the Accord summary, processed the Deathworld classification, and arrived at a conclusion that visibly unsettled him, which for a Yanari was an achievement roughly equivalent to unsettling a stone wall. He leaned over to his aide during a recess and whispered something. His aide looked at Dara. His aide did not look back. The second faction, the Oresi Compact, had done their research in advance. Their security consultant, a former Accord military assessor named Torvel Das, had pulled every available file on human physiology, combat history, and endurance statistics. He presented his findings to the Compact delegation in a private briefing that could be summarized as, "Be polite, do not make sudden movements, and under no circumstances attempt to intimidate the human, because she will wait you out, and humans were literally built to chase prey until it died of exhaustion, and we do not want to find out what that looks like in a diplomatic context." The Compact delegation was polite. They were very polite. It was the most productive session the Compact had managed in 3 years of negotiations. Only the third faction, the Drihari Assembly, had failed to do their homework. This was consistent with their general approach to the negotiations, which could be described as aggressive, dismissive, and reliant on the assumption that everyone else in the room was more afraid of them than they were. Their head of delegation was a being named Vok Aren, who had built his entire career on the principle that intimidation was a valid substitute for compromise. He was large, loud, and had a personal security retinue that he deliberately stationed at uncomfortable proximity to everyone else in the room, a tactic that had worked consistently for 11 years of regional politics. On the second day of negotiations, Vok Aren's retinue positioned themselves directly behind Ambassador Priyesh's chair. Dara did not move. She simply shifted her weight, almost imperceptibly, and looked at the retinue. Just looked. The retinue held their position for approximately 4 minutes. Then, by some unspoken collective decision, they drifted backward, not quickly, casually, as if they had somewhere else to be. Actually, now that they thought about it, Vok Aren noticed. He spent the rest of the session in the particular silence of someone who is recalculating. That evening, in the secure debrief that Priyesh held with his team every night, Quilvet said, with the tone of someone reporting a minor miracle, "The Drihari filed a procedural request this afternoon. They want to adjust the retinue proximity guidelines." Priyesh looked up from his notes. "Voluntarily?" "Yes." He glanced at Dara, who was standing near the door reviewing the next day's session schedule on a data tablet. He said. She did not look up. "I just stood there," she said. "Yes," Priyesh agreed. "That's what I mean." What happened on the third day was not in anyone's diplomatic playbook. It was not in the security contingency files. It was frankly not in any document that anyone had ever thought to write, because no one had ever sat down and considered the specific scenario of a Drihari Assembly faction operative attempting to introduce a paralytic aerosol compound into the negotiation suite's ventilation system while a human soldier was doing her sweep of the environmental controls. The operative had picked his moment carefully. Shift change. Minimal corridor traffic. 17 seconds between sensor sweeps. He had planned it with the precision of someone who had done this before and gotten away with it. What he had not planned for was Dara. She was not supposed to be in that corridor. Her sweep pattern did not include the tertiary environmental junction. She had deviated from her posted route by exactly one hallway, because something, she would later tell the Incident Review Board, had felt slightly wrong about the air recycler cycle timing, and she had wanted to check it. Humans, by the way, do not have any documented sensory ability to detect mechanical timing irregularities through intuition. The Accord's Xenobiological Division spent 3 weeks on that one particular detail, and ultimately filed it under the category of statistically improbable. But we checked the footage, so the operative saw her rounding the corner and made the reasonable assessment that a single being, lightly armed, mid-sweep, was manageable. He had taken down Velhari Sentinels before. He was confident. The Incident Review Board later described the subsequent 43 seconds as, quote, a sequence of events that our panel found difficult to reconstruct accurately due to the speed at which they occurred, which is a very diplomatic way of saying that by the time station security arrived, the operative was restrained, the aerosol compound was secured, and Dara was standing in the corridor looking faintly irritated that she had scuffed her boot. She had not drawn her weapon. This fact was included in the review board report, separately highlighted, with a note, Station Security Chief Penvar Ulo reviewed the corridor footage 4 times. Then she called her counterpart on the Velhari Sentinel Division and said, without preamble, have you seen the humans' corridor footage? Her counterpart had. There was a long silence. We trained for 4 years, Penvar said. Yes, her counterpart said. She did that with no apparent preparation, in a routine sweep. Yes, her counterpart said again. I need a drink, Penvar said. We all do, her counterpart agreed. The news of the corridor incident moved through Varath Crossing, the way news always moves through a diplomatic station, which is to say, officially it did not move at all, and unofficially everyone knew about it before breakfast. Vok Aaron knew about it by 0700. He sat with the information for a very long time, turning it over the way you might turn over a stone you had just found in your boot, trying to decide if it was dangerous or simply deeply unpleasant. His security chief, a thick-necked Drehari veteran named Prul Setek, had pulled the incident report through back channels and delivered it with the expression of someone who had revised several previously held opinions overnight. She did not use her weapon, Prul said. I read it, Vok said. She did not appear to sustain any meaningful injury. I read it. The operative, Prul continued, with the careful tone of someone choosing words the way you choose footing on unstable ground, was a certified close-quarters specialist. He had a Tier 2 combat classification. Vok Aaron looked at his security chief for a long moment. And she did not draw her weapon. No. Another silence, heavy and particular. Reschedule my morning brief, Vok said quietly. I want to review our delegation's posture on the territorial boundary clauses. Prul blinked. This was, in the language of Drehari internal politics, roughly equivalent to a seismic event. The territorial boundary clauses were the hill Vok Aaron had announced, publicly and repeatedly, that he intended to die on, metaphorically. All of them, Vok said. Meanwhile, Ambassador Priyesh Nair was having what could charitably be described as a complicated morning. The aerosol compound had been identified overnight as a Drehari-manufactured paralytic agent, which created a diplomatic problem of considerable size, because you could not formally accuse a negotiating faction of attempted chemical interference during active peace talks without either proving it beyond contestation or lighting the entire process on fire. He was sitting with Quilvet and his senior legal advisor, a precise and perpetually exhausted Tesseri named Fevin Mole, working through the procedural options, when Dara knocked on his office door and came in. I wanted to flag something, she said. Priyesh gestured for her to continue. The operative I detained last night. He had a Drehari Assembly Transit credential, but his biometric profile doesn't match any registered Assembly personnel. I cross-checked it this morning against the Accord's Open Security Registry. She set a data chip on his desk. He's Drehari, but he's not Assembly. He's a private contractor. Someone hired him independently. Fevin Mall picked up the data chip, reviewed it, set it down with the small, precise movement of someone who had just understood something they wished they hadn't. That changes the calculus, she said. It means the assembly delegation may not have authorized it, Priyesh said slowly. Or, Dara said, not unkindly, it means someone in the assembly wanted deniability and paid for it. She paused. I'm not a diplomat. That's your read to make. I just thought you should have the full picture. Priyesh looked at her for a moment. 11 years in the corridor, 4 assassination attempts, and somehow this was the first protection detail that had ever handed him operationally useful intelligence before his morning tea. Thank you, Corporal, he said. She nodded and went back to her post. Quilvet watched her go. Then, in a very small voice, said, I am beginning to think personnel made an excellent decision. Don't tell them that, Priyesh said. They'll become insufferable. The 4th day of negotiations was, by any metric, the strangest one. Councillor Brix Vayan of the Yanari delegation arrived early, which he had never done. The Oresi Compact's lead negotiator, a measured silver-carapaced diplomat named Advocate Sheen Voru, arrived with a revised position paper on resource-sharing protocols that represented the single largest concession the Compact had offered in 2 years, and Vach Aaron walked into the session chamber, sat down and asked, with the stiff, uncomfortable posture of a being doing something deeply contrary to his nature, whether there was room on the afternoon agenda to revisit the boundary framework. 3 delegations, 3 significant movements, all on the same morning. Priyesh, who had not survived 11 years in the corridor by failing to notice patterns, spent the first recess standing at the observation window with a cup of tea, watching the station's exterior lights blink against the dark, and thinking. Dara appeared beside him. She did not say anything. She rarely did. In the unstructured moments, she simply stood, watching the same window with the same quiet attention she gave everything, which was, Priyesh had come to understand, not blankness, but a kind of constant, low-level readiness that she had apparently been running since birth. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes, sir. Do you ever turn it off? She considered this with genuine seriousness, which he appreciated. The awareness. Yes. A pause. Outside, a cargo shuttle made its slow arc toward the docking ring. I sleep fine, if that's what you're asking, she said. It's not anxiety, it's just, she seemed to search for the word, paying attention. Humans are like that. All of them. The ones who grew up outside a lot, she said, with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. My grandmother could tell you which direction rain was coming from by the way her knee felt. My uncle used to say she was just reading the air. The almost smile became slightly more definite. My grandmother said his knee wasn't old enough to have opinions yet. Priyesh laughed. Genuinely, for the first time in about 4 days. It felt good. She sounds formidable, he said. She was 83 and she kept bees, Dara said. Which on Earth is basically a sport. He looked at her sideways. Is it dangerous? Moderately. And she did it recreationally. With great enthusiasm, Dara confirmed. Priyesh shook his head slowly. I've been representing humanity in interstellar diplomacy for over a decade, he said, and I am still not sure the rest of the galaxy fully understands what we are. Probably better that way, she said pleasantly. The afternoon session was where things went sideways. Not because of the negotiations, which were, improbably, proceeding with more genuine momentum than they had seen in months. It was because at 1440 hours, station time, Varath Crossing's primary communications array went dark. Not a power fluctuation. Not a scheduled maintenance window. Dark cut. Deliberately, the lights in the session chamber shifted to emergency amber. Every delegate's personal communicator returned the same message, no signal. The station's internal security channel produced static, then silence, then a single, clipped transmission from Chief Penvar Ulo. Lockdown protocol. All delegations remain in secure locations. This is not a drill. Then her channel went dead too. In the 4 seconds that followed, 11 diplomatic personnel, 4 security retinue members, 3 Accord support staff, and 1 very alarmed Quilvet, all attempted to do different things simultaneously, which produced the specific variety of organized chaos that Priyesh had spent his career learning to recognize and manage. He was on his feet. Everyone stay seated. Most of them stayed seated. Dara was already at the door. She did not open it. She put 2 fingers against the frame, very lightly, and stood absolutely still for a moment with her eyes closed, which was such an unexpected thing to see that it actually made Vok Aaron's security chief stop moving and stare. Then she opened her eyes, stepped back from the door, and turned to Priyesh with the calm expression of someone delivering a weather report. 3 beings in the corridor, she said, moving slowly, trying not to make noise, which means they know the normal sound profile of the station and they're working against it, armed, based on the weight of their steps, not station security. The pattern's wrong. A brief pause, I'd say 8 minutes before they reach this door, if they're being cautious, which they currently are. The room was very quiet. Torvel Das, the Oresi security consultant, said, carefully. How did you? She listened to the floor, Priyesh said, with the tone of a man who had updated his understanding of the world several times in the past 4 days, and was now simply moving with events. He looked at Dara. Options. This room has 1 door and 2 ventilation exits, she said. Ventilation exits are too small for most of the delegation. There's a maintenance access way behind the environmental panel on the north wall. It connects to the station's secondary service corridor and comes out near the docking ring. She looked at Quilvet. You've been on this station for 3 years. Where does the secondary service corridor connect to emergency life pods? Quilvet's 7 limbs did something complicated that resolved into, I am terrified, but also I know the answer. Junction 47. It's a 12-minute walk. We'll do it in 8, Dara said. Everyone on their feet. Quiet. Single file, Ambassador in the middle. Vok Aaron stood up with everyone else, and Priyesh clocked the exact moment when the head of the Drahari delegation, who had built his career on being the most dangerous presence in any room he walked into, understood with complete clarity that he was not in fact the most dangerous presence in this particular room. It was a complicated expression, somewhere between humbling and relieved. Stay close, Dara said, pulling the environmental panel free from the wall with a single practiced motion that suggested she had mentally rehearsed it the moment she first walked into the room, which she had. Watch your footing. No talking unless I say. They moved. What followed was not the version of events that ended up in the official Accord incident report, which described the situation as a coordinated security response leveraging diplomatic protection protocols. What actually happened was that Corporal Dara Okeke moved 11 diplomats and assorted personnel through a maintenance access way that smelled of recycled coolant and old wiring, past 2 patrol positions that she detected early enough to reroute around entirely, across a service junction where she made a split-second decision to stop everyone in place for 90 seconds based on a sound she heard 4 corridors away that no one else could hear, and to the emergency docking ring without a single person being injured, in 7 minutes and 40 seconds. At the docking ring, they found Chief Penvar Ulo and a partial security team who had barricaded the pod access and were extremely surprised to see them. How? Penvar said. Access way from the session chamber, Dara said. The 3 tangos in the main corridor should be approaching the session room in about 90 seconds. If you want them contained, now's the window. Penvar stared at her for a full 2 seconds. Then she was on her radio. It took station security 4 minutes to detain all 3 operatives. It took another hour to restore the communications array. It took 6 hours of forensic work to establish that the attack had been organized by a Drahari splinter faction with no formal assembly authorization, which was precisely the intelligence distinction that Dara had handed Priyesh that morning. Someone had wanted to bury these negotiations. They had planned it carefully, funded it expensively, and executed it with professional precision. They had not planned for Corporal Dara Okeke. In the debrief that evening, Fivan Mole said, with the exhausted precision of someone doing legal calculus at the end of a very long day, the Assembly will formally disavow the splinter faction within 24 hours. They don't have a choice. The paper trail is too clean, and they need the negotiations to survive. She looked at Priyesh. This might actually accelerate the timeline. It usually does, Priyesh said, when someone tries to blow the table up and fails. Vok Aaron requested a private word with the ambassador that evening. He sat across the table in the small side office with the stiff formality of a being engaged in something he found personally expensive, and said without preamble, I want to negotiate in good faith. Priyesh waited. I want on the record that my delegation had no knowledge of the attack. Duly noted, Priyesh said. Another pause. Vach Aran's eyes moved briefly to the door, beyond which Dara was standing in the corridor. "Your protection detail," he said carefully. "Yes, she is." He seemed to be searching for the right word in a language that did not have a comfortable one for what he was trying to say. "Unsettling. She's very professional," Priyesh said neutrally. "That is not what I mean." Vach Aran's jaw worked briefly. "I have been in politics for 20 years. I have sat across the table from Velhari enforcers, Kreth military advisors, and one Duan negotiator who once ended a trade dispute by standing on the table." He folded his hands. "I have never been in a room where I was, genuinely, uncertain about my security team's ability to manage a situation." Priyesh looked at him steadily. "And now you have. And now I have," Vach agreed. They sat with that for a moment. "She is not a threat to you," Priyesh said finally. "She's here to make sure that everyone in this negotiation lives long enough to reach an agreement, including your delegation." "Including my delegation," Vach repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of it. "She proved that today," Priyesh said. "She didn't sort by faction when she moved people to the docking ring. She moved everyone." Vach Aran was quiet for a long time. Outside the office's single window, Varath Crossing's running lights made their slow, repetitive circuit against the dark. "Your species," he said finally, "is very strange." "We get that a lot," Priyesh said. The Yanari Corridor Accord was signed 19 days later. It was not a perfect document. No meaningful peace agreement ever is. They are all a set of imperfect solutions to intractable problems, held together by the collective decision to keep trying. But it was real, it was signed, and it held. There is a footnote in the Accord's official diplomatic history, buried in Appendix 7, which attributes the successful conclusion of talks to, quote, "a protective security arrangement that created unexpected stability across all three delegations." That is the diplomatic way of saying that three factions who had been circling each other for decades sat down and actually negotiated, partly because a human soldier stood in a room and looked at them, and something very old and very deep in the part of their brains that remembered what predators felt like, said, clearly and without ambiguity, "There are worse things to fear than each other." Corporal Dara Okeke was reassigned to a new post 3 months later. Her performance review, filed by Ambassador Priyesh Nair, was 70 lines long. It contained phrases like exceptional threat assessment and demonstrated initiative under pressure, and cross-faction confidence stabilization, which is the formal diplomatic language for what actually happened. In the informal notes section, which is technically optional, Priyesh wrote 4 words: "Do not reassign her." They reassigned her to a 6-faction dispute in the outer Helen Reach, with 12 diplomatic personnel, a compromised communications infrastructure, and a security threat assessment rated at severe. She arrived 40 minutes early. She checked the magnetic clamps. And somewhere in the Accord's Office of Personnel Allocation, the person who had signed that first assignment order went back to their desk, looked at the growing file of incident reports and improbable outcomes and quietly revised threat assessments, and smiled the small private smile of someone who had made an accidental decision that kept turning out to be right. They did not tell anyone. Some victories are better appreciated quietly. Out in the Helen Reach, a new set of delegations looked across their session chamber at the small human standing beside the ambassador's chair, and felt, for reasons none of them could fully articulate, significantly less inclined toward hostility than they had been that morning, which was, all things considered, exactly the point.